Did I just do that whole introduction without my, I did. Okay. Sorry. I will do this again quickly. I was muted. One of the hazards of Zoom, you think we would all learn this by now, but that's not quite the case. So just so you know, we are recording today's session. My colleague Karen Bucola will be posting a link that you can use to download the slides in the chat window. She'll repeat that a few times so that you can access those. As we go along, please type any questions that you might have in the chat window. And if you request a certificate of participation, we should have those out to you within a week. I am Betsy Hill, president of Brainware Learning Company, and I'm delighted to have you all here today. And I'm especially delighted to have my friend and colleague, Nancy Weinstein, joining us to make this presentation. Nancy is just a terrific person, as well as being a very smart businesswoman and a parent who has responded to what she experienced in a way that it can be brought to many, many other parents and schools and teachers and students, and it's information that is really exciting and essential for everybody. So I'm delighted that she's agreed to join us today to share with us some of the findings from the recently completed study funded by the National Science Foundation. So I think that's what I said the first time when I was on mute, but Nancy, I really want to welcome you. I can also point out that when I looked up Nancy's profile on the Mindprint Learning website, I realized why we see eye to eye so many times. Her cognitive strengths are abstract reasoning and verbal reasoning. Those are also strengths of mine. And she is weaker in spatial perception and visual memory, which I am also. So maybe that explains everything. So Nancy, welcome.
Thank you, Betsy. Thank you for that wonderful introduction. I will say, for those of you who have trouble with memory or verbal memory, Mindprint, like a fingerprint, because two minds are alike, but hopefully that will help you remember our name, help you find us online, and hopefully you like our logo. That's intended to look like a fingerprint. And then Betsy, I want to thank you for that kind introduction, and then ask you to perhaps even send that introduction to my husband, who's pictured here next to me. Betsy's alluded to part of my story, and so it's probably important for you to know who I am and why I'm here presenting to you. That is, in fact, my husband. Those are my daughters. I think it's now 10 years ago that Please No More Math. Frankly, those faces are not as whiny and not quite as negative, but they, in all fairness, still persist somewhat, but it's been our journey. I was in finance, my husband was in finance, I also did engineering, and like two girls, and particularly because they were girls, it drove me crazy that they didn't like math. And that this probably sounds crazy to you. I'm not a tiger mom, but it did launch me on this journey to say, one, how is it possible that genetically possible that two people who are so sort of similar and learn and think in very similar ways can have two daughters who are so extremely different in how they approach problem solving, how they think. You can see in that picture, they actually don't look alike. That's another whole conversation. But they are both ours, and we love them. And on a very positive note, the one on the left is actually going into industrial design, and she'll start college as a freshman next year. So math is a journey. It's a journey for a lot of students. I think it's in a lot of ways because we, and I'm sure many people agree, we don't always do math right by students. And so we'll spend some time talking about what we did around math, what we found around math, and maybe how we can change the lens around math. So you now have a sense of where I started my journey 10 years ago. Now we have a wonderful company where we offer this type of cognitive assessment for students ages 8 all the way through 21, and hopefully guide them on their journey. So when learning is challenging, they can know how to pivot themselves. But in the earlier years, their teachers and parents can help guide them based on how they learn best, not just on what they know and where they are in a particular moment on an achievement test, but how they can best get there. So that is what we will talk about today. So what we'll cover, we will cover some science of learning theory to how we are implementing it into practice, the findings of our phase 1 National Science Foundation research, specifically on math. Much of that translates to other areas which we know, but given the greatest concerns around math and the importance of STEM in the future, we opted to do our initial focus on math. But for those of you who are expert in reading or science, please know a lot of this would translate into those other areas. We work with all Common Core standards. So we as a company have always known the importance of using data to inform rather than observations. That has come more to the forefront in the last year, we know. And so there are really quite clear implications from this research into how we can create more equitable learning environments. Again, you'll hear me use this phrase around changing your lens. And so that's really where it's going to be about how can we shift the paradigm just enough so that everyone can be successful. And then finally, we hope to leave time for your questions. I will sort of leave it to Betsy to make sure that we have time for your questions. So if she thinks that I am taking too long, she will move me along, and I encourage her to do that. I also encourage you to put questions in the chat. And I guess you can't raise your hand, but as we're going, and Betsy will be monitoring the chat. And so if it's a timely question, she'll jump in and make sure I'm answering it so that you're not missing anything and it's sort of holding you back from understanding and moving forward with us, because that's how we're all learning together. So first, I want to just start with some sort of basic vocabulary about what every student, every adult needs to succeed, right? And so these are our definitions. They are actually consistent with science, but they're not actually, or how research scientists talk about things, but they're not always consistent with the words that we throw around in everyday work. So I'm going to give you the definitions that we're going to be working from, and then just know that people call things differently. So the first is academic. This is generally what we're the most familiar with. This is what we measure in school. This is what our goals in schools tend to be, right? Like the fund of knowledge, things that I know and I learned, right? So nobody came out of the womb knowing their math facts. You learn them. Some learn them faster than others, but the goal was to learn them. Calculus, physics. Some of us never learn that stuff, but that's the goal. That's academic knowledge, right? So that's one grouping of skills. The second grouping of skills is getting a lot more airtime these days, always known to be important, but just getting with the pandemic, talking about social emotional. And we know a lot of schools have a lot more focus on this in the fall, and plans for focus on this in the fall. But why I learn? Am I engaged? Am I motivated? If I am not doing well, do I understand that I'm not doing well? And do I know how to change? And do I know self-efficacy, how to ask for help, right? Those are sort of the core social emotional skills that as an educational community in a school setting that we should, I would argue, be thinking about and addressing every day. There are other things other social emotional skills that students bring with them that are really hard for schools to address directly, but impact learning. And those are things like anxiety and depression and other mental health issues. I'm not going to talk about them today. They're extraordinarily important. They affect all of this, but we're going to talk today about things that we believe and our research would suggest educators can control and have the resources at their fingertips to be able to address in their classrooms today. And then the final category where Mindprint has its core expertise are in cognitive skills. And sometimes folks, and this is what I was alluding to earlier, will call academic skills cognitive skills, right? We're going to be using a very specific, set of skills when we talk about cognitive skills, which is how I learn best, how I best take in information, right? How I understand information. So areas of reasoning and critical thinking, right? Do I learn best with pictures? Do I learn best with words when you talk to me? Do I need to see it? Or do I need to touch and feel it? And from Betsy's explanation earlier or comment earlier, she and I are both not good at the, if I tinker with it with my hands, I'll understand it better. That's like your spatial skills. That's not me. And it sounds like that's not Betsy either. But for some students, that's magic. So reasoning, that's the second one. It's below memorization, which is core, which is like, even if I understood it, did it stick? Is it there for me when I need to use it and apply it? Then the third category is focus and follow through, right? So I might be the most capable student of learning and remembering, but if I can't pay attention, and it's a different area of the brain, but if I cannot pay attention and follow through, nothing is going to get done. And so that's another set of skills that we need to understand where students are struggling and when they're not, so we can support them. And then the time and investment it takes you to get there. So some students do work really quickly and efficiently, and some are far more slow and deliberate. Time, we don't give kids all the time they need in schools, right? And then even if we give them the time in school, if they work slowly and deliberately, they need to be willing to make that investment at home if they're going to do well on their homework, because it takes them more time. And so we need to think about that aspect of learning. And so how we create the glue to make sure that academically students know what they need to know, and the cognitive and social emotional are going to drive that. So what do we know about this, and why are we even having this conversation? So this pyramid on the left is I have not seen anyone contradict this research. It's been sort of codified since 1971, but it's based on it was even before that, where people understood this to be true, and it's sort of indisputable in the academic research, which is cognitive skills, how I learn, form the foundation of learning. They explain 50% of the variability in outcomes. So if two students have gone all the way through the same school for 13 years, right, come from similar backgrounds, one of them's an A student, one of them is a D student, most of that, the majority of that can be explained by their cognitive skills. Some of it, less so, but very important, is social emotional, meaning were they motivated, were they engaged, when they had a problem, did they go out and self-advocate, did they even realize when they had a problem, right? Those layering together with the curriculum and the content that they're taught is going to drive academic outcomes, and that's going to create this virtuous cycle, or in some cases a negative cycle, around propelling students to success. And so the idea is that if you understand that foundational layer, and if if Betsy and I are sitting in geometry class and somebody hands us 3D models and we're frustrated, can they hand us instead a picture and draw a comparison to what it looks like and has been used before, and we're going to understand it better? Or can they explain it to us in words and then have us re-explain it because we learn better with words and we're going to understand it, and not just make us sit there and struggle with the 3D model because we don't have strong spatial skills? And that's going to change. I mean, it changes everything for kids. And yet, this is what we do as an industry. We spend 75% of our funds, and I'll just make the suggestion that that correlates with the time spent as well, of trying to just pour more academic information into kids. You don't know it, let's do it again. You don't know it, let's try again. Rather than saying, how are you learning this? Why are you not learning this? What can we do differently? The good news is that SEL number is starting to reach equivalency of where it should be. That's one hopefully positive thing that came out of the pandemic, to realize that social emotional skills are important and drive learning outcomes, and we should spend more time on them. And if a student doesn't come to school ready to learn, they're not going to learn. And so we need to focus on that as an educational community. You can see that very small orange sliver. That is where we spend money on cognitive skills today. It's mostly on the tails, if you will, of our distribution. So the students who are really struggling, or the students who are gifted. And that's the students in the proverbial chunky middle, often don't get any kind of cognitive testing or any sort of objective insight into how they might learn differently, better, and succeed in different ways. And so we have a full green triangle on that top of the pyramid, and I would argue we really should cut it in half to reflect the fact that 50% of our kids are not succeeding in school. So with that, why do we do it this way, right? So why does the pyramid look the way it does if research tells us something very different? So it's easiest to measure academic knowledge, right? So that's why we measure it. That's why we spend time on it. It's the outcomes, and it's really where we want to go, right? So in that sense, it does make sense, right? At the end of the day, it doesn't really matter what your cognitive skills are. Like, this is probably the first time I've been in a group where somebody asked me about my cognitive skills, but like, I've had to do math at the dinner table, right? It's like that's what matters, right? So it's not a fun family game that we play. I've had to do math because I'm doing the tip, or we're breaking up the meal. But it's easy to measure. We can measure whether or not a student can do it or not, and it's really where we want them to go. So it makes sense that that's why we spend a lot of time on that, and we should spend some time on that. We should spend a good portion of time on that. But and by doing that, we actually got gains, right? So before we tested kids, before the 90s, before No Child Left Behind, like scores went up with No Child Left Behind. We may not want to talk about it, but there was more learned knowledge. That said, there's only so much you can push that, right? So the proverbial, you can't get it, you know, can always get a little bit more toothpaste out of the tube, but there comes a point of diminishing returns. And so adding on more achievement tests is not going to get us to the answer, given we know what the pyramid looks like, which is an indisputed pyramid, right? So why are we stuck here? Historically, there has been a lack of scalable measurement tools to test cognition. So it typically requires time with a very educated specialist who knows the field and can sit there with the student one-on-one and understand their cognition. With what we're doing at Mindprint, that's changed, but really, like, that's the reality. You know, we just didn't have the tools to do it, and technology has changed that. SEL. So people will have lots of questions after this, and so I'm just going to say there really is not great measurement tools for individual students on their social emotional skills. And that is because most of those tools rely on student self-report and teacher observation. So a lot of the conversation around equity right now is because people are questioning whether or not teachers can accurately observe students through a truly objective lens and understand where they're strong, where they're weak, what they need in all sorts of things, whether it's academic achievement, cognitive, or social emotional. It's really hard, right? To you have 30 kids in a classroom and to understand what each kid needs in each different way, and where their behavior, which is an outcome, is not always consistent with what's going on inside. So that's one reason. And then the second reason is that the self-report measures that we ask students to do, well, students are not inherently self-aware. The data is actually very clear about that. So if we're going to use what students tell us about where they're strong, where they're weak, what they need, they might not really know. So that has a lot to do with it. So there's that. And then this last one, resistance to change, I will let you make your own determination of how much of a factor there is. It's not what we currently do, thinking about cognitive at all. SEL is getting better, but you know, where are we as an industry? So with that background, let me tell you what we found with our Mindprint research. So, first let me tell you who was involved in our research. I just added this slide this morning. So we worked with 500 middle school students, grades 5 through 8 in Massachusetts. We gave all of the students the Mindprint, the NWEA map growth, which is one of the most well-respected benchmark assessments. We use the math portion, and we gave them the Mindprint SEL survey that we created. We did student experience sampling, and then we actually looked at our data, how it might have changed, because we have lots of data that we've done with schools, not in NSF research, but on our own, and made some pre and post pandemic comparisons that we'll talk about, because there were some interesting findings that we saw, things that, you know, the pandemic may have affected in the short term. So this is what we found. Again, this is NSF, National Science Foundation sponsored research. For those of you who are familiar with universal design, we worked with CAST, and they're the leaders in universal design theory. And so they were our third-party research to make sure that, you know, we were doing everything at the highest levels of academic research. So first order, what we found is the cognitive skills that Mindprint measures, so you see them here in pink, could explain, actually, in this case, over 50% of the outcomes that we saw in map growth. So, like, this is something that Mindprint's seen in the past. It is consistent with that chart that I showed you earlier, 50% of outcomes, right? So we got what we expected. That was nice. You always want to see sort of some of that nice validation. But this is what we also saw. So what you see here in blue are the personality and engagement traits that we measured with our SEL survey, right? And so I made a comment earlier about student self-awareness and student self-report. I want to be abundantly clear. This was student self-awareness and self-report. And what we discovered was that it accounted for a small portion, when just looked at alone, a small portion, not none, but a very small portion of explaining student achievement, right? So the idea that, like, if you are looking at personality, if you are very conscientious and you check your work, will that get you a higher score? All other things being equal, right? And just sort of like I'm sorry, not all other things, like just like conscientiousness alone, like students who said I'm conscientious, did they do better than students who said I'm not? Like, it actually admitted that they're not very conscientious and they don't check the work, right? So you did see like a small bump. What we discovered when we put all of this together was that the interaction of these skills, even though they were self-report, with cognition actually enabled us to explain 60 to 70% of the variability of outcomes in students. So pretty much teachers could understand most of why student A is underperforming relative to student B. And the reason that that is so important is because now that you understand why, you know which levers to pull to enhance that student's performance. Really game changing, right? I mean, to put this in context, the next greatest thing that's in the 30% range is student family income, right? Which we know we can't change that easily, right? And have very little control over. And now we know where to pull the levers. And the levers don't mean changing these things and looking at these things as outcomes, but knowing things like for Betsy and myself, and I keep on picking on me and Betsy, but that's okay. At least it's okay with me. I guess,
absolutely, absolutely. Yes.
Right.
And you're absolutely correct. I would have to try to explain to you, and you would have to try to explain to me in words what that model had anything to do with.
Right. And so that's not changing very much. That doesn't require another curriculum. That does not require an extra set of hands. It does not require another test aside from Mindprint to say, I can now understand that I can, if you will, break the curve. So even though Betsy and I would be predicted to not do as well in geometry compared to other areas of math because of our weaker spatial perception today, based on other students and students not using any of these strategies, we would be able to break that curve and do better because somebody knew to tell us to explain that model in words and not just sit there with our hands trying to manipulate it, looking at each other and saying, I have no idea. And by the way, may I just recommend that you not be in the car with Betsy when she's parallel parking, because people with weak spatial perception are not the best at parallel parking either.
Thank goodness for my backup camera.
Okay. So Betsy, I see there are a few things in the chat, but is there any sort of pressing questions before I go to
I think
our
that
poll?
the only thing is I think people are maybe didn't get the concept of resistance to change. They're asking about how do you what I'm reading is, they may have perceived this as being student resistance to change or student resistance to this kind of thing. And I think in general, you were talking about really more of the educational system and teachers and other educators.
So so thank you for asking that. And so I really was, so students do what we tell them to do, or they don't do what we tell them to do, but they don't really have a lot of choice in the system, right? They either do what we tell them to do or they don't do it and don't do well. I am talking about teachers and educators and administrators. So if we don't want to change what we look at and the measures that we use, or the lens with which we look at students, then none of this happens. And there's plenty of research talking about the importance of teacher engagement in driving change in schools. So the resistance to change was, are folks willing to adopt a new lens? Are they willing to look at factors outside of just those achievement tests and saying students who don't achieve either aren't trying or we just need to make them do it the same way and do more of it. And we've seen some more openness to change with the pandemic and the discussions about SEL, the stuff in blue, right? And that's actually really encouraging, right? That alone will help. We would argue that alone, and the data would argue that alone is not going to move the needle significantly until we step back and say, students learn differently. We all have different strengths and different needs. And so when a student's not succeeding, we don't just kind of blame it on the stuff in blue, nor do we just give them more of the same in the academic side. We change the approach.
And I think your next point is really going to point to exactly where we can put the blame in
So
terms of.
we don't want to blame anyone or anything.
No, it's not. We're not blaming anybody, but we're blaming some skills that we know play a really substantial role in math.
So let's move on to that. So this
Right.
next slide, and thank you for clarifying. So this next slide shows the skills that Mindprint measures, right? That were responsible for explaining that 50+% of outcomes. So
we have a little poll here. We would like to get everybody's thoughts. So I've launched the poll, and it's got a list of these skills there, and would like everybody to just click on the skill that they think is the most important skill or the best predictor of middle school math performance.
And I'll ask that if you need to raise your hand or put a question in the chat if you are unfamiliar with a specific term and would like me to define it. And what I will say is that most teachers were not taught about these skills in school, and we know that most teachers have a familiarity with them, but unfortunately haven't spent as much time with them as we think would be really important in supporting outcomes. So please ask the questions, because that's how we all learn.
Yeah, that's a great point. So we have about 70% of our participants who have voted, and it looks like it's slowing down. So I'm going to go ahead and end the poll, and I'm going to share the results. So hopefully everybody can see it. Can you see it, Nancy?
I can see it. So
number one things were working memory and abstract reasoning.
Can everybody else see the poll or no?
They should be able to. So the working memory and abstract reasoning got the most votes. Attention and flexible thinking were next. Little bit of verbal memory, a little bit of visual memory, and 6% said mentioned verbal reasoning.
Okay. All right. So now on the next slide, should we close that? Can you do that?
Yeah,
I can do that.
I will do that. I will stop sharing results.
Yeah, keep a picture of that, because that's probably what most people would have. I mean, that's probably consistent with
our intuitions, and beliefs, and yeah.
Mm-hmm. Great. And here's the answer. So verbal reasoning, our ability to understand and use words, is the highest predictor of math performance in middle school. In fact, it's the highest predictor of math performance in high school, as well as on the math section of the ACT and the SAT. And as surprising as it is, it's, there's an understandable reason for it, which is, and so I'm not going to go into as much detail as I could, but we can come back to it at the end if folks want me to go deeper. But we ask students to read directions. We ask them to read word problems. When we teach them math, we tend to disproportionately do it with words. A teacher explaining things. Teachers often, in a lot of cases, don't have models at the ready to give students, so they explain it. So there's one picture on the page, and then there's a 5-minute explanation that's going back and forth in the classroom. That's the reality of it. And there's parts of verbal reasoning, right? You need to reason through and be able to explain things, and when you can explain it, then you know you understand it. So there is verbal reasoning actually absolutely, under all scenarios, should play a role in our math understanding. But for those of you who voted for abstract reasoning at the top, yeah, you would think that our ability to understand patterns, shapes, the sort of being able to imagine things that aren't right in front of us, right, that would drive math performance. And in fact, when you get to college level math, abstract reasoning is the greatest predictor, but not in what we do in K-12. Those two are pretty much heads and tails above everything else in predictive value. What was interesting with the pandemic is that these two bottom skills, which are still important, just not typically in the top four, were attention and visual memory. And so we think that has something to do, frankly, with, students taking their MAP test at home. And if they didn't have a good environment and they weren't good at self-regulation, that maybe they didn't put in the full amount of time that they needed to. And just the fact that, if you're not paying attention to the test, you're not going to do your best work. So, and we saw we know by report of most teachers, and then in combination with our data, that students with weaker attention in general, not always, but most students with weaker attention did worse or struggled with doing school during the pandemic unless they had a parent who knew exactly how to create the right environment for them. And there were parents that did a phenomenal job doing that. But for students who have weaker attention and were left on their own, a lot of work didn't get done. A lot of kids didn't get out of bed. A lot of homework didn't get turned in. And if you're not doing your homework and you're not in class and you're not paying attention, you're not learning. So it kind of makes sense. The other one that also does make sense is visual memory. So there's a foundation of knowledge that you need, and many would argue that it's more important in math than it is in pretty much any other subject on which to build, right? So if you don't know your math facts, it's going to be really hard to do long division. If you can't do long division, it's going to be really hard to do algebra, right? So it does tend to build. And so if students, and so it tends to build, and the solution for memory and making sure that it's there is repetition, right? Like the more times we hear it and see it, the more likely we are to remember it. And we have to see that over time. So teachers know, like even just implicitly, maybe even when they're not thinking about it, are constantly repeating things in the classroom, right? So, even if we covered, long division in October, when a teacher is sort of in the classroom, they're bringing up long division naturally. If they see a student is still struggling with long division, they review it, they repeat it. That kind of built-in natural repetition did not happen during the pandemic, during remote learning, right? That's a skill that teachers who teach remotely develop over time to make sure they're not missing that stuff. But our teachers were not trained to look for things like that and to repeat things like that. And so as a result, there will likely be more gaps in knowledge. And this would suggest like the students who naturally remember more easily naturally did better. And for those other students, we might need to do more backfilling. Okay, so I'm going to pause there and let Betsy take it away unless anyone has any questions that they want me to answer right away.
I'm not seeing any more questions at this point. So,
okay.
So what I wanted to do next is to share with you a little bit of what this looks like for students, particularly those who struggle with math or reading or something else. And we work with students. We have been using the Mindprint cognitive assessment for, I don't know how many, since I found it. I'd been looking for a long time for something that was as useful, as scalable, as practical, as reliable, and all the rest of it. And so I just took I wanted to sort of see what our students look like on average. And I just took the last 37 of them that had been through and taken Mindprint. And so you can think of this, it might even be 37 students. It's a big classroom, I guess, a little bit big, but on average, they are looking, pretty average, although, and you can see the two blue lines, those represent the middle of the expected range. And these are percentile rankings. So if you're in between those two lines, then that's what Nancy was referring to basically is the chunky middle. And so on average, these students are are there except in processing speed. We actually have, I think, probably a disproportionate number of students who have processing speed issues. But I wanted to show this first and then the next slide to make the point that, and if you could switch the slide, Nancy, that would be great, to see how incredibly variable these skills are. And so, you know, what you have with most of these skills is a student who actually couldn't even get a valid score or was scoring at the first percentile, while other students were performing higher. And many, you can see many scores at the 96th percentile or above, which means is essentially the gifted range. So you have within these learners some skills that are very strong. You might have a child with strong verbal reasoning, but terrible abstract reasoning, or vice versa. Really big discrepancies between visual and verbal memory. And these are really, you know, you can take just about any group of learners and you're going to see a tremendous amount of variability. Now, the other thing that I wanted to share with you after we look at this tremendous variability is to say, not only can we benefit students by helping understand their learning strengths, we can also help build cognitive skills. And the next slide is going to show you for these 37 students what their post-tests look like. So they went through 12 weeks of cognitive training with Brainware Safari, and you can see the changes across the board, getting the students, including in processing speed, up into the middle of the expected range, but improvements in verbal reasoning, improvements in verbal memory and flexible thinking, working memory, attention, really across the board. And so, we've also seen, in fact, more students qualify for gifted programs following cognitive training. So I wanted to just connect this, because when we give students the ability to both understand and then to actually build their cognitive skills, we have empowered them with an amazing amount of increased capacity for learning.
Thank you,
So,
Betsy.
Back to you.
All right, thank you, Betsy. And I mean, the ability to impact this, again, it can drive the outcomes that we're talking about. And so thinking about this and putting it in context, because of equity, and because of what we just saw on that list of skills, I think it's important to really get a feel for what makes an equitable classroom and how we can make sure that all of our students are learning math, let's say, in this particular way, and how do we switch things up. So the next question that we want to ask quickly is for folks to just say, like, look at these skills, which skill do you think varies the most by SES is shorthand for socioeconomic status. So high poverty districts versus low poverty districts, right? Kids whose families struggle economically versus kids who are in an affluent suburban school. Which skill
we have a poll for that too. So I'm launching that. So there are two questions. The first one is, which two skills, so you can vote for two skills this time, which two skills show the most variability based on socioeconomic status? So if you're comparing affluent schools to high poverty schools. And then the second question is, which do you think is the least variable? So we're about 25% of the attendees have voted. So we'll keep it open for a little while here. I have to say, Nancy, it's pretty exciting to be able to see these impacts and to be able to work from data as opposed to guesses and intuition. So voting's still going on. We'll give everybody another few moments to cast their ballot. It looks like there are a couple of people who are having difficulty with the poll function, and I've had that happen a couple of times in Zoom before. Generally, people have been able to do it, but sometimes people have difficulty, and I don't know why. So I'm sorry if you're not able to. You can certainly type your thoughts in the chat window as well. Okay, so I'm going to end the poll again. Thank you, everybody, for sharing your perspectives. It's really great. I'm going to share the results. And so, as you can see, that everybody's been listening to you, Nancy, and making probably a pretty good guess about the first one.
Yeah. So least variability. I want to see what folks wrote about.
So, and the least variable they said was
spatial perception.
Spatial perception, but abstract reasoning was and visual memory were close.
Yeah, so the visual skills. Okay, that's really, really good. Okay, so really, really good. And let me just say, nailed it. So this is a typical suburban school distribution. So just the bar chart, so you can get a sense of the relative number of students. So the strengths are here on the left. The skills to support are here on the right. And you get kind of like this bell curve, although the support skills, we're going to say that, COVID effect a little bit. We wouldn't have expected this to be, quite so high. But you sort of see that you get a bell curve in the typical suburban school with a little bit of skew to the left, right? Where early exposure to literacy and reinforcement, and that positive reinforcement creates this virtuous positive cycle in learning, right? So probably not a surprise. And what we see in a high poverty urban school, and what we know to be the case in high poverty communities, which is that there's just not simply as much early exposure to literacy, and it is having an impact on verbal skills. And again, there might be some COVID effect here, but I think we can see that there is a clear difference in the distributions, right? And yes, we do see many of the same types of characteristics, a lot of the same distribution in attention in high poverty communities. The difference there is that the students are exposed to chronic stress, and that chronic stress, like constantly having to be on your toes, worrying about things that other kids don't always have to worry about, right? Like, where is your next meal going to come from? That level of stress basically makes a kid look like they can't focus, and quite understandably.
Right? Nancy, one question in the chat window about the data. Does it include or exclude those with learning disabilities?
Includes.
Okay, so this was the whole school population.
Yeah.
Okay. I think that was, someone was trying to see if it was, inclusive of them, and
to be fair, I mean, the percent of students diagnosed with learning disabilities is pretty much consistent across schools, like, because that's another conversation for another day. And
the key for the acronym, so I think probably HEMELE
is high expected, middle expected, low expected, and I missed the little T next to my strength there. So there's no such thing as T85. It was meant to be an 85.
Yeah, so those are the ranges of percentile rankings. So,
and those are sort of the standard percentiles that folks use in in a standard distribution.
Right, exactly.
And then here's the thing, is that there's pretty much no difference in abstract reasoning. So to people's point around where people sort of voted on the visual skills, they're right. There's pretty much no difference. And then I made a point earlier that might have sort of not resonated, but so just in case, I will say it again. Abstract reasoning is the highest correlation with STEM performance in college. So think about that. Across the board, these students have the same capability. The district that we're using here is like, for the high poverty district, is impoverished. It is impoverished. And the distribution looks pretty much the same. You know, it depends on the school. There's always going to be some variability. But if you let that sort of just digest that about what we do in schools and where we can shift things, even just a little bit, that can really just, not a new curriculum, but a new way of presenting, a new way of thinking about it, that can really change things. This is also what we found, which is that when you look at giftedness through the lens of abstract reasoning, so apologies to those of you who have not seen a Mindprint report before, but basically we take our 10 skills, we plot them on a spectrum. For the purpose of this slide, what you need to know is that strengths are here over here in green, and if you're in the top 5% of the population, which is indisputably considered gifted, I haven't really seen anyone dispute that percentile on abstract reasoning, because different districts use different metrics. We get the same percent of students testing gifted in high poverty schools as we do in those affluent suburban districts when we use abstract reasoning as the metric. And that is in spite of the fact that these kiddos tend to be struggling with attention, right? So that's what you see over here in the purple bucket, which is they're in the bottom 16%, and this student is in particular. So without being able to focus, with having a short attention span through no fault of their own, and through just because of, in many cases, the environment in which they are growing up, they were still able to do that.
Which means it's so automatic. It's just that it's effortless for them. It just makes so much sense. It's how their brains.
Right. And we always say that when a student is struggling with executive functions, we know that we're getting the minimum that they can do. We have no idea what the maximum is, because we have no idea about the impact of, you know, if, when, and how weak attention might be affecting them, right? If attention sort of, this student less so, low expected range, you know, it's not, but you know, once they hit the bottom purple range, like we know it's sort of can impact any particular activity that they are not particularly interested in. Engagement's another whole area that we could explore, but we won't today. So Betsy, do we have time for your last set of slides, or
I'm going to do it. I'm just going to do it really fast because we've technically got 3 minutes left. I just wanted to show a little bit about what this might look like in an actual school. This is Maple Crest Middle School in Kokomo, Indiana, which is a very high poverty school, where just to show how this plays out in the real world, 92% of the students in the school were in the at-risk or support range for attention and or working memory. And you can also see the difference between verbal reasoning at the 14th percentile on average versus abstract reasoning at the 35th percentile on average. So I just, you know, we know that the data is the data, but this is what it looks like. And I can tell you that the principal, Tom Hughes, is very, very aware and very struck by these data. And they did an implementation to include some cognitive training. Unfortunately, it was the beginning of the COVID year, so they did not get through the entire program. But what you can see on the next slide basically is the average percentile point gains that these students got, even from just, normally the implementation of Brainware is 36 sessions over 12 weeks. So even with 12 sessions, we're seeing gains in of 6 percentile points. Typically, we would expect gains of 15, 6 to 20 to 25% percentile point gains. And it depends a lot, of course, on the skill, but their gains were substantially in the verbal areas, as well as spatial perception, which was particularly low for this group. So just to underscore how important these are, and the fact that we can help kids both by understanding them and helping them strengthen these skills.
Okay. I'm just going to sum it up really quickly, and then aware of everyone's time. Apologies for going maybe a minute over. Hopefully we won't. Please drop off when you need to, but we'll stay on and answer questions if anyone has them. So we would say the implications for equity is we need to meet the reality of where students are. We might want them to be someplace else. We might not want there to be differences in profiles, but there are also great similarities. How do we take advantage of that? We need, as is, community to address the executive functions challenges first, right? So students not paying attention, they can't focus, they can't learn. So we can put modest supports in place to make sure that students, when they sit in their chairs, are focused and with us. Find ways to teach STEM without such an enormous cognitive load on language skills. STEM is STEM. We don't need all the words. When we can use pictures, try and use pictures or add pictures. It's not about not lowering the standards on language, but it is saying, we probably don't need so many words to teach algebra. So again, don't lower your standards, but change your lens. And then key takeaways. Yes, you can predict and address variability in outcomes. We see that the environmental circumstances do affect the ability to learn. And so we would say that the equity is adapting to your students' reality, but you can address the reality once you understand it. And so hopefully we can all do that together. Betsy and I are here to answer any questions or to support you in any way we can in supporting students. So have a wonderful, relaxing summer. For those of you who got time off, well deserved, and we're here. Unless Betsy, I don't know what else you have to add.
No, there's somebody, I can't figure out the name. It says they're on the UDL, the Universal Design for Learning National Faculty, and found this work very interesting. So I wanted to give you that.
Can I add that we will, that the research scientists will be presenting this at the CAST conference at the end of July. So Dr. Jess Ropin and Dr. Robert Dolan, if you want to attend their session.
So that's great. I don't see any other questions, but we'll just give it a minute and see if anybody, Karen, did you see any other questions that I might have missed, or?
No, you got them all.
Oh my gosh, my verbal reasoning must barely be good. Yes, we will be providing a link to the presentation. In fact, Karen, you might post that again, if you would. Someone has asked about getting a PDF of the presentation. So there we have a link actually where you can download that, and that link should be in the follow-up email as well, so you can look for that. So I think that's about it. Very important for speech and language pathologists to use this information. So getting, it's really important for all of us to understand the role that these skills play and how important they are. And the fact that, if we're spending less than 5% of our time on what accounts for 50% of the variability, there's huge leverage There's huge potential for really impacting student outcomes if we just shift that focus a little bit. So Nancy, thank you so much. As always, you enlighten us and get us interested in thinking in different ways. And we really appreciate it. Feel free to reach out to either one of us following up on the presentation. This is the stuff that we love to talk about and we think is really important, and are really committed to helping students achieve to the very best of their abilities and capacities. So thanks again for coming today, and we will look forward to seeing you all at another Neuroscience and Education webinar sometime soon. What are resources for educators? I'm not sure what that question is. But we will follow up with an email and see if we can help you out for that, both things on Mindprint and on Brainware Safari. All right, thank you all and have a great rest of your week.